Is it true that if Francis Ngannou had stayed with the UFC and fought Jon Jones, that he would have made more money than had he done what he did, which is to go take 2 boxing fights and ultimately sign with the PFL? Probably not. Almost certainly not. But let's talk about it. Let's see what we can figure out. Why are we even talking about this? Well, UFC President Dana White spoke to the media following yesterday's Contender Series event and was asked about it as a follow-up to an interview he did with Kevin Iole. First, here's the comment he made at the Contender Series event.
Earlier today, you did an interview with Kevin, and you mentioned that it wasn't necessarily true Francis would have made more money boxing than he would have if he stayed in the UFC.
Right.
My question to you is, you always said, he didn't want to stick around because he didn't want to fight Jon Jones. Why didn't you mention the fact that he would have made more money to fight Jon then? It would have sort of backed up your point. Why did it take you until now to bring it up?
Because why? I don't give a shit. What's the difference?
I'm saying it's interesting for people to realize.
Because I know all the shit that you people don't know. And I don't care what everybody says. It doesn't matter to me. But that's a fact. He was offered more money. Because I know the real numbers. I know the real numbers. And let me tell you what. I don't want to call him out, but let me tell you what. He did anything to make that fucking fight. And he tried to. Yeah.
Now, I'm going to come back to this in just a second, but let me add to it what Dana White said to Kevin Iole. Here is the quote. I'm going to read it to you. That's not necessarily true when he was talking about whether you can make more money in boxing. That's the BS publicly that people believe, but that's not the truth. Total BS, total BS. That's the whole myth that makes everybody go, oh, let's effing go to boxing and all this BS. Boxing doesn't work. Boxing does not work. What makes it work? You need a Saudi effing trillionaire to make effing fights. And even Saudi trillionaires get tired of the effing BS. It's all effing myth. It's all myth. Like the whole statement you just made, that's absolutely positively not true. It's those types of effing statements and those types of quotes by the media that makes all this S. All these fights are happening. It takes a Saudi effing trillionaire. Every effing guy that tries to go do the boxing thing, they all end up losing S loads of effing money. The model does not work. A Saudi unlimited amount of money pops up, and that's what makes these fights happen. And even guys with that kind of money get effing tired. First, let me actually give a bit of an olive leaf to Dana. While his answer to Kevin Iole is kind of weird because he ends up saying it's not necessarily true that you make more money in boxing than you would doing MMA. He ends up making kind of this promoter argument that promoters don't make the right amount of money or enough money, which is a separate argument from whether or not the fighters make money. In fact, it's a completely different argument. So I don't understand why he trailed off into that different direction, but is it true that no matter what, you'll always make more money in boxing if you're a UFC fighter and you leave to go fight in boxing? No, of course, that's not necessarily true. Case in point, Nate Diaz goes to fight Jorge Masvidal, and he has now sued Fan Mio because he didn't get basically any of the money that he was essentially promised other than what they paid up front to the tune of $1 million. But there's a whole lot more that they owed. I made a video about this. You can check it out here above. You'll get the idea. So like this idea that just because you fight boxing that the business model or every promoter out there will do business with you in a way that where your purse is naturally going to go up, this is obviously not true. So fair point. It is not necessarily true that you can make more every single time doing boxing. Boxing just means more money. But there's a couple of problems here with what Dana White said that really have to be acknowledged. Let's talk about just the basics overall. Let me show you some court documents from the UFC antitrust trial. This comes from the plaintiffs when they were cobbling together evidence for some of their claims. They come to this particular moment, and here you have, quite in front of you, statements from Bob Arum as well as other promoters in boxing, Lou DiBella, who basically note the reality of boxing is that 80% or, upwards of 70% end up going to the fighter, and then the house basically takes the rest of it. I mean, it's obviously split a few more ways than that, but you get the idea. It's a 70 to 80% split with the fighters, and the UFC is the exact opposite. It's not just the case with Bob Arum. It's not just the case with Lou DiBella. In fact, they go through Golden Boy in the same document, and their numbers are pretty similar. I think they were in the mid to high 70s in terms of what percentage the fighters ultimately got in terms of a payout. Just on basic math, they're up against it on this particular case. The UFC and Dana White in particular has noted, listen, our model works, the UFC model works. And certainly for them, it does, to the point where they have established a monopoly inside of mixed martial arts. But you can't have it both ways. You can't take 80%, leaving the fighters 20% or less, which we know from these same court documents is the case, this in perpetuity 20% or less as a fixed cost for what UFC fighters will be paid, and then also make the case that you could just make more fighting over here. It can't be both. Of course, there are going to be individual cases where that will be certain. We just noted it's not 100% true that if you go into boxing, you're always going to make more. And you can look at individual peer groups and be like, if you were this level of UFC, which is roughly equivalent to this level of boxing, who makes more? There's going to be some differences along the way. But certainly at the upper end, the top guys on A-sides, on pay-per-views, there's a massive discrepancy between what they can get in boxing versus in MMA, irrespective of whether or not the Saudis are involved or not. Canelo Alvarez has done no business with the Saudis, and of course Canelo is one of the biggest stars, if not the biggest star in boxing, but to the point I'm trying to make, he's done no business with the Saudis, and he makes an extraordinary amount of money, not just from pay-per-view sales and the gate, but concessions, the whole 9 yards, merch, you name it, closed circuit. On top of it, Saudis aren't involved at all, and look at the kind of money he's making. Now, let's look at what Francis was given in his PFL deal. This is not exhaustive, but this is the high notes. I'm going to put it up on the screen. Take a look for yourself. First of all, it's for 2 or 3 fights. We still haven't gotten quite the answer on that. The UFC deal was supposed to be for 3. However, we'll come back to that in a second as well. Guarantees a high 7-figure purse. Again, we think somewhere in the $5 to $8 million range. A split of the event's net profits. How much those will be, well, I don't know, but certainly an enormous concession here for PFL to give them that. A signing bonus to serve as a brand ambassador for the PFL. The right to have his own sponsors in the cage. That could potentially be huge. Non-exclusive with regards to boxing. We'll come back to that as well. No champions clause or other extensions. This is the point. Even if he had signed a 3-fight deal with the UFC, in order to make the maximum amount, he would have had to remain champion, would have had to win, which would have added on other extensions by virtue of the champions clause. So that would have really hindered him. And then a minimum salary possibly as high as $1 million. This, of course, was updated. And we found out that his opponents were going to get $2 million. So it's not just a raise of his overall money. It's a raise of the overall money going out everywhere. Now, what you could say is, if the UFC had offered Francis the deal that the PFL gave him, he would have made more money than what he made ultimately with this PFL deal. That doesn't seem too crazy, but of course that's really not what they had offered him. It all goes back to what was going to happen with the UFC deal. So what they had initially offered him, according to most reports, was $8 million to fight Jon Jones. Not a small amount of money, certainly. And then, of course, there would have been pay-per-view points on top. Probably, again, these are some estimates and some what people say, so you're going to have to take the math here. It's a little bit back of the envelope. Make your judgments accordingly, but that would have added probably another $2 million or so. So it's about safe to say that he would have made $10 million. Again, could have been a little bit less, could have been a little bit more, but somewhere in that ballpark. The problem is the contract after that, according to the reports that we have, if he had 2 more fights and defended those belts during that time, it would have made around $5 to $6 million for the 2 subsequent fights thereafter. Again, it could have been a little bit less, could have been a little bit more. It's hard to say. But the point we're trying to make here is, over the course of 3 fights, it would have been somewhere, we believe, in that $15 to $16 million range. Again, it could have been a little bit more, could have been a little bit less. Here's why that's interesting. Both Francis Ngannou and his manager, Markel Martin, have both said that the fight he took with Tyson Fury, just that fight alone, not even counting the Anthony Joshua fight, would have been more than what he would have made for the 3 fights that the UFC was potentially offering him, even in an all-winning fight case. Which means that the fight with Tyson Fury is arguably above the $15 million fight level, so probably less than 20, but somewhere in between. John Nash has estimated that the fight purse was probably in the $18 million range. That doesn't even include the Anthony Joshua fight, which reportedly went for $20 million. Now, you might be saying, "Hi, I saw that the Tyson Fury fight purse was $10 million. That's only an estimate based on what Tyson Fury had said. Again, we're doing a little bit of just sort of basing this on what the public pronouncements of people have been to this point, and you could take the truth value of that however you'd like, but this is where we are. So understand something. Could Francis have made more fighting in the UFC than he did ultimately in these 2 boxing fights, and then whatever he's going to get with the PFL, or just take the 2 boxing fights? Arguably, he wouldn't even get enough with any of them put together just based on the Tyson Fury fight. You add in the Anthony Joshua fight, the counter would have been if he had fought John multiple times and those fights did like incredible blockbuster numbers. And of course, they would have done well. I think anyone would have admitted they would have done well, but would they have done 2 million buys, both of them? You probably would have to be in that ballpark to even get close to what we're talking about between both the Fury and the Joshua fights combined to reach that kind of a level, and he wasn't even able to get one of those fights during his time in the UFC. Now he would have had to get both of them, arguably won both of them in order to keep fighting the third fight on the contract to get another 2 to 3 to potentially even $5 million after that. So like the answer is it mathematically possible that he could have done it staying with the UFC? It is, at least in theory, possible, but highly improbable, highly unlikely. It would have required multiple bouts with Jon Jones, 2, potentially even 3, and it would have required those bouts to have sold extraordinarily well. Not just well like we know it would have. We're granting it would have sold well. It would have needed to have sold extraordinarily well for that to happen. And by the way, Jon got injured this year, so like he could have been injured in the bout subsequent to training. Francis, if he had won the first one and there was going to be a rematch, he would have had to have taken another fight, which now means you're getting a lower purse number. Like there's all different kinds of conditional factors that would have had to have lined up for that to even be in the realm of discussion. And it all seems deeply, deeply improbable, especially going back to what Francis and his manager had said, which was just the Fury fight alone is more than what they would have made in the not just the entirety of what he had made previously in the UFC, but that new contract on those 3 fights. But there's another wrinkle here, which is, would he have gotten 1 or 2 Jones fights? I mean, takes 2 to tango. The answer is who's to say? I don't know, but consider these tweets from Jon Jones in 2021. Now, this was 2 years prior to, of course, everything that happened in 2023, but just consider them. Here's the first of 3. I had a brief phone meeting with UFC's lawyers Hunter, that's Hunter Campbell, a few days ago. As of right now, I expressed to him that anywhere around 8 to 10 million would be way too low for a fight of this magnitude. He's, of course, talking about the Francis Ngannou fight. That's all that has been discussed so far. He continues. I've been working my ass off for years, concussions, surgeries, fighting the toughest competition UFC had to offer throughout my 20s for right around $2 million per fight. I'm just trying to have my payday, the fight that all of us fighters believe is one day possible. And of course, he concludes with, I tweeted, show me the money, and that evidently pissed off the boss. What a learning lesson. I feel like if Conor would have sent that same tweet, there would have been whiskey night. Now again, this was 2 years ago, 3 years ago at this point, 2 years prior to Francis leaving, and a lot has changed in that time. The numbers that they were offering him in 2021, by the way, didn't go up by the time 2023 came around, if that's what they were offering Francis to take it. But I bring this all up to say, yeah, Jon's fighting now, and he fought Cyril Gane, and of course he's going to be fighting Stipe Miocic coming around, but like, what is to say that there would have been any guarantee that he would have had at least 2 fights with Jon to even get close to the kind of numbers that he was able to get against Joshua, which, by the way, didn't sell well necessarily on pay-per-view, much more guaranteed revenue. And again, going back to the Tyson Fury fight, another one that didn't sell necessarily all that well on pay-per-view, guaranteed revenue. You have much higher upside, much better guarantees. The Tyson Fury fight alone could have surpassed the Jon fight plus the 2 other ones on the contract, to say nothing of the Joshua one. So, to answer the question, is it possible? Is it possible that that Francis could have made as much staying with the UFC? It is possible, but it's highly unlikely. It would have required any number of dominoes to fall, of which Francis was not in control of. And I know he took a risk leaving the UFC before he ever had a Tyson Fury fight lined up, but of course he was already in contact with the folks at Saudi Arabia and Riyadh season before that, probably had some indication that this was a direction they were going to go, took a risk on himself, but then look at the upside ultimately of what happened there. It could have fallen flat on his face. It could have been the case, by the way, if you're just comparing what he would have earned with PFL MMA fights relative to what he would have earned with UFC MMA fights. Yes, he would have earned a lot less, guarantees even being what they are. There's simply no question about that. It's not that the UFC offered him overall a bad deal as such, but the PFL deal with the possibility of boxing, with the Fury fight based on estimates being potentially in the $18 million range, according to John Nash. Then you add on the Joshua fight, which is believed to have been $20 million. I can tell you, having discussions with some folks close to Francis, I think overall, with this PFL contract, he'll probably make somewhere between 40 and 50 million when it's all said and done. It's very, very hard for me to believe a 3-fight deal that he would have had, or even a 4-fight deal he would have had with UFC, would have gotten close to 40 to 50 million that he ultimately would end up, in all likelihood, making with this boxing contract. So Dana's got a point. Boxing is not the be-all, end-all for everyone. Not everyone's going to make more money. That part is true. But Francis definitely made a lot more money, definitely had a lot more latitude, definitely got a deal with the PFL with guarantees and then the option to go box that radically transformed his finances. And while mathematically conceivable on the UFC side that it could have been that way, it would have required any number of different things of which there was already resistance and difficulty procuring that would have had to have been a virtual guarantee for that to happen. Yeah, no, Francis made the right call in terms of where he was going to make the most money. That was outside of the UFC.